When I was 16, there was a kid in there who was 18. His father was in there, and his grandfather was in there. And they was all doing over 20. 3 generations just wiped.
We know that it's not that the children fail, it's that the system has been failing our children.
So who should be working and living and existing and offering the solutions to the traumatized young people from the community?
It's important to bring individuals from the community because they are dealing or have dealt with it directly.
Credible messenger mentors are people who have had experience in the justice system and want to get involved in trying to steer people out of the justice system because there's way too many people in the justice system.
It's kind of a stunning idea because here's the system saying
individuals who are ex-offenders are now being featured prominently as partners with justice systems to effect change in the community. This is a major paradigm shift going on.
The idea of a credible messenger has always existed.
And to me, being a credible messenger is a person that can go out there and persuade them to, change their life and want to spread the word about, listen, I've been in the streets, I've been locked up, I'm your age, you can change.
What makes me a credible messenger is that I'm impacted by the same systems. Family's been impacted.
Some people fear, like, what do you mean? Like, you're gonna put some ex-convict working with, like, my kid? And it's like, I wish I could show you, in this person's situation, like this is exactly who you want working with your kid.
It positions credible messengers in communities that are being ravaged by crime and urban trauma and puts them in a position to be healers. It's a double impact. And that as you serve, it's redemptive and healing and restorative for you.
Our community has all the skills, the talent, but not the resource.
The sense of now we have the opportunity to disseminate what we have learned about the approach, but more importantly, as a city, we can now train and cultivate and develop men and women and prepare them to reach the youth in their communities.
You could live in your hood, but you don't gotta be from your hood. You get what I'm trying to say? You don't gotta be a product of your hood.
It's about the community healing the community.
Credible messenger to me is a person that can spread the word to the youth and help, get them back on their feet because everybody falls.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here on
the story of Arches. I would like to let you know the birth of Arches, exactly how this came about, where we're going, and so you have a little context as to the evaluation. Arches Transformative Mentoring uses curriculum-based group mentoring to help at-risk young adults transform attitudes and behaviors that have led to violence and/or criminal activity. It is designed to meet young people where they are in this process of pro-social engagement, focusing on changes in cognition and thinking that often precede the ability for successful conflict resolution and to secure concrete attainments in education and employment. The target population served by this intervention will include high-risk young adults between the ages of 16 and 24 who may struggle to make connections with various aspects of life, such as conflict resolution, healthy relationships, family, communication, responsible behavior, handling difficult feelings, education, employment, and/or exhibiting antisocial thinking. Arches is grounded in positive youth development and uses an evidence-based curriculum employing cognitive behavioral principles. The program has open enrollment. The group meets twice per week, 3 hours per session on average. Most sites offer 24/7 crisis support. A participant can attend 48 sessions for a period of 6 to 12 months. Some of the core components of the Arches mentoring model include a group process that encourages participants to become an independent support system for each other, an interactive journaling curriculum based on cognitive behavioral principles delivered by culturally appropriate mentors, credible messengers, mentors who are available for intensive support, advice, and guidance, incorporation of positive youth development values, principles, and practices, case management support from probation officers, activities, trips, events, participant stipends, up to $800 over 6 months, hot meals, Metro cards, focus on the achievement of pro-social developmental outcomes, such as the ability to seek help in a crisis, get along with others, and some of the softer skills such as showing up on time and handling a job interview, skills that can prepare a person for education, employment, and civic participation. There's a training and development aspect to this, which was done by Community Connections for Youth. So how did Arches come about? My name is Paul Richards. I am the director for the Young Men's Initiative programming at the Department of Probation here in New York City. I want to give you a little story. I'll make it very brief, just to give you the birth of Arches. Sometime in 2011, 2012, there was discussion about this idea of transformative mentoring. At the time, this was a community-based initiative being done out in Oakland, California. Although it wasn't yet connected with governmental agencies, it was more of a community-based type of initiative done by community-based organizations. And there was a couple of core components that really resonated with the New York City Department of Probation. One was the idea of a credible messenger. These were individuals who were gang involved, incarcerated, or involved in negative and self-destructive activities in the community, who had now turned their lives around and wanted to give back to their communities. And now they were taking on these roles as mentors. Then there was the idea of mentoring. It was defined and carried out in a very different way. It wasn't the traditional mentoring where you have an adult volunteer who agrees to spend X amount of time with a young person to be a role model, sounding board, support system. And although these things are very, very important, this type of mentoring was focused and intentional about targeting specific thinking, attitudes, and behaviors that lead to criminal activity. The focus was on decision-making, peer associations, crisis intervention, how to resolve conflicts peacefully, develop better coping mechanisms other than substance abuse, alcohol, etc. So this type of mentoring would be more transformative than just supportive. It was also very important that we go out into the community to speak with organizations about the concept. We wanted their feedback, and more importantly, we wanted their partnership. The idea was not only to get these young people thinking about their own personal development and changing their mindset, but to also get them to start thinking about development of their community. We've all heard the saying that it takes a village to raise a child. Well, that village is hurting, and it needs our support, our resources, and our commitment to be real. So we were very clear up front about what we wanted to achieve. It was about a mentoring program, but it was about so much more. It was about how does the New York City Department of Probation move away from relying on incarceration and punitive measures and move towards reinvesting in the community and building capacity for those communities to serve our young brothers and sisters. Here today we have Maurice Windley, who was one of our very first project coordinators. He operated a site out of Harlem Commonwealth Council in West Harlem. Maurice was not only one of our very first, but he was our go-to in terms of training and development, and assisted us along with Community Connections for Youth. Maurice.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, Maurice Windley. It's definitely a pleasure to be able to come and share about this fantastic initiative. I'm just going to reflect on the partnership with community and the New York City Department of Probation. As Paul has stated, this is a unique opportunity in terms of where you have a criminal justice system, particularly in New York City, now looking to partner with community-based organizations. And so my experience of coming through it, I'll start from a reflection of where, from the very RFP process, I remember being invited down to a meeting to review the RFP. Immediately, probation broke the paradigm in that they asked for the input of everyone in the room and what is your vision, and they allowed everyone to speak into the process. So this idea of collective thinking, collective impact was set at the ground. From that point, I remember another pivotal opportunity when we convened with probation officers and other senior leaders of probation at one of the neighborhood probation offices. We actually did a training, an all-day training event where they met with credible messenger programs from across Harlem. At that time, it was about 4 programs operating in Harlem at that time, as well as the credible messenger staffs. And we all engaged in this deep relational, experiential exercises that really caused each other to see people not as objects, but as human beings. Typically, in communities of color, communities that have dealt with the devastation of criminality, there is an adversarial relationship with probation or anything that represents law enforcement. So for us to even come together, it represented also a healing opportunity, and again, to take strides toward authentic partnership. One of the things the training really brought to bear was that seeing each other in our unique contributions. One of the defining exercises of that day was when probation officers were actually in a role reversal where they were basically the client, and they had to get the experience of what a young person goes through. Throughout the initiative, working with probation officers, as he stated, we would receive the referrals. We had to partner with them, and it was a dynamic that had to be managed. Obviously, the young people coming to probation, they have their own set of ideas, and they look at us as an extension of that. So are you for me or are you against me? Can I trust you? We had to work through those things, and that came with communication, trusting in the credible messengers. That came through a lot of communication, consistent communication, dialogue, and also most of the time the opportunities came in the crisis. You know, we had young men, young women who, when faced with charges or potentially being violated, we had to make some critical decisions. But because the information was communicated in timely manners, there were many interventions that took place that avoided young people going further into the system. Again, as a community leader coming from Harlem, this really represented a major paradigm shift just to be able to partner on common footing with a government system where they were looking for your input for this initiative. And that's key if we're going to talk about community and government partnerships, specifically as it relates to launching this type of intervention. There has to be a level of transparency. There has to be a level of leveling the ground so that way everyone has equal voice and equal contribution. Again, it's a work in progress, and we believe that while we're here today has shown that this effort is validated. I think that when we think about relationships, and that's one of the core things, it's not about programs, it's about relationships. Many of our young people, the root cause of many of their experiences with the criminal justice system, the root is traced to relational deficits. And so when we are able to touch those relational deficits and impassion the officers, I've seen parole officers, probation officers rather, weep over these young people. And that's unprecedented. We've participated in graduations where they took these young people from seeing them as clients, but seeing them as their own children. And so again, he talked about the village concept. And so being able to foster a true partnership that's built on principles of love, that's built on principles of connection, and understanding how we as a collective can come together and strategize and build this relational web around our young people. It was pivotal. Like I said, there was many officers that we had the opportunity to partner with through a variety of trainings, and this was all key to the success of this model. Without the buy-in from probation officers, without the buy-in from senior leaders like Paul, commissioners, all the way down, it was a top-down, bottom-up approach. And without that buy-in, this would not have been able to move forward. Again, the community still needs to be healed, and being able to recognize that there's that need for healing was key. And being able to mobilize and empower community leaders. Credible messages are the elders. These are the individuals returning home from prison who have the influence in the community. Now you're giving them an opportunity to do what they want to do, and at the same time to be able to influence policy, to influence impact. So it's been a transformative experience all around in terms of just seeing young people seeing probation officers in a different lens, not seeing them as an adversary, an enemy, but seeing them as a resource and an ally. In the same vein, seeing probation officers, seeing credible messengers and their clients in a different lens, from a humane lens, from moving away from punitive and paternalistic views and really coming to a viewpoint of partnership. And so, again, this has been a tremendous journey. This is not a program. This is a movement. This is a profound social movement that is taking place. It's unprecedented to really kind of see this level of deep partnership taking place, and we're just beginning. And so we really invite you to really come and learn this approach, which is significant. I think that it can have major implications and impact to any urban center that's dealing with the issues that come from historic trauma due to criminality.
Thank you. We'd like to turn it over now to Parker.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Paul and Maurice for kicking us off with background on the Arches program. So my name is Parker Krasny. I am Assistant Director of Programs and Partnerships with the Mayor's Office for Economic Opportunity. We've been involved with the Arches program since its launch in 2012. And we're very proud and excited to be sharing with you the impact and implementation findings. I wanted to give a quick introduction to some of the offices that were involved in the execution, but first I'll just mention you're going to hear today from, in presenting the evaluation from Matthew Lynch, Research Associate at the Justice Policy Center of the Urban Institute, and Nancy Andeloro, a Research Scientist with the Department of Probation. I work again with an office, the Mayor's Office for Economic Opportunity. We are a 10-year-old office, and our goal is to use evidence and innovation to advance equity and combat poverty in New York City. We work collaboratively with city agencies, such as New York City Department of Probation, to implement and oversee human service programs, advance research, data, and design in the city's program, policy development, service delivery, and budget decisions. The Arches program is also an initiative of the New York City Young Men's Initiative, another entity within the Mayor's Office, the original funder of the Arches program. Young Men's Initiative, YMI, is the nation's most comprehensive effort to improve the lives of young boys and men of color and combat the disparities experienced by them in the areas of education, employment, health, and justice system involvement. And lastly, of course, our colleagues in the Department of Probation, who work to help build stronger and safer communities in New York City by working with and supervising people on probation, fostering positive change in decision-making and behavior, expanding opportunities for them to move out of the criminal justice system through meaningful education, employment, health services, family engagement, and civic participation. And I also want to acknowledge our colleagues at the Urban Institute. As I mentioned, Matthew is joining us. Urban Institute is a nearly 50-year-old nonprofit social science research firm based out of Washington, D.C., and has been a great partner to New York City and to us in executing this project. So briefly, the goals of this evaluation. The impact evaluation sought to assess quantitatively what impact the ARCHES program model is having on recidivism of participants in the program. In addition to that, we engaged in an extensive qualitative evaluation, which you'll hear more about, the goal of which was to assess participant and staff experiences in the program, their attitudes towards the program, to identify best practices, and ultimately to develop recommendations for program enhancement, which you'll hear a bit about at the end. And before I turn it over to Matthew to talk us through a bit of the methodology about the program, I did just want to flag for audience members, you should see on your screen a chat box. We will be taking questions later on in the webinar. So if they occur, please feel free to enter them and we will get to them at the end. And briefly, as you see there on the screen, so our office worked collaboratively with Probation, YMI, and an entity called the Mayor's Fund on the design of the evaluation. Urban Institute conducted the implementation evaluation, the qualitative
evaluation.
Thanks
so much, Parker.
Urban Institute and the Department of Probation.
If the manager of the PowerPoint could actually take it back a few slides to the evaluation overview, that would be really great.
Now we're ready to hand it over to Matthew to talk us through the evaluation.
Thank you. So yes, my name is Matthew Lynch. I am from the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit research organization in Washington, D.C. We had the opportunity over the last few years to collaborate with New York City Opportunity and New York City's Department of Probation around the evaluation of the ARCHES program. And what I'm going to talk to you now is a little bit about the evaluation overview and provide you with then a follow-up on the methodology before turning it over to the evaluation results from my colleague from the Department of Probation. So next slide, please. First, I'm going to talk quickly about the evaluation goals. First, Urban was selected in November of 2015 to be the evaluator for the ARCHES Transformative Mentoring Program in New York City. The research and analysis process for that evaluation actually took place from January of 2016 to June of 2017, and the final report is set to be released here in October of 2017, which is very exciting. The evaluation goals, we really wanted to align the goals of our evaluation with those of the ARCHES program. And the primary two goals of the program itself are to reduce the justice involvement of its participants, as well as to increase positive behavioral change for its participants as well. We identified some practices associated with successful operation and outcomes, and then helped develop some recommendations for program enhancements, which I will talk about in a few moments. Next slide, please. The management of the evaluation itself was very collaborative. Again, I mentioned the New York City Opportunity and the Department of Probation. We all worked very closely together to oversee the research design and as well as to conduct and to speak through the implementation and impact evaluation itself. But New York City Opportunity, with input from Department of Probation, Young Man's Initiative, and the Mayor's Fund, all oversaw the research design and execution. The Urban Institute primarily conducted the implementation evaluation, and the Urban Institute, along with the Department of Probation, conducted the impact evaluation. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to speak a little bit about the evaluation methodology. There are two pieces of our evaluation that I'm going to speak about. We did a mixed methods approach where we did an impact evaluation as well as a implementation evaluation. First is the impact evaluation, in which we conducted a quasi-experimental design We did propensity score matching to identify both a group of folks from the Arches program as well as those from similar groups of other individuals on probation that could make up the comparison group. We compared felony and misdemeanor arrest, rearrest, and reconviction rates of both 12 and 24 months after they began probation. We also investigated the role of the curriculum and the attitude and behavioral changes that the curriculum and the program was assessed to make. The implementation evaluation was conducted also by the Urban Institute. We initially were on site for quite a bit of these activities. We conducted a random stratified sample of the 18 current sites that at the time in 2015 and 2016 were currently running. We selected 8 of those sites for the implementation work and the implementation activities, which you can see on your screen included interviews with staff and stakeholders, focus groups with participants and alumni, site-specific observations, as well as a literature review that was conducted. The research questions themselves related back to those of the Arches program and included things like how the program was implemented, how it was perceived by its stakeholders, and any lessons that were to be learned. And Urban had individuals on site for multiple day site visits, we concluded the evaluation, the implementation evaluation, did some coding around that and turned those into lessons learned and recommendations. Now I'm going to turn over the next section of this presentation to my colleague in the Department of Probation to discuss the implementation findings.
Good afternoon. I'm Nancy Andaloro. I'm a research scientist at the New York City Department of Probation, and I worked really closely with the Urban team, Matthew and his team. So I'm here to talk about the impact findings, and then we'll turn it back over to Matthew in a little bit to talk about the implementation findings. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show you the primary findings, which are that the Arches group is less likely to be reconvicted of a felony when compared to a similar situated group of people on probation that are not in a program. It reduces 1-year felony reconvictions by over 2/3. That's 69% lower 12 months after beginning probation. And it reduces 2-year felony reconviction rates by over half. That's 57%. 24 months after beginning probation. And when we looked at this by age group, we found that the impact was driven, there were some significant relationships here by the group that are under age 18, so the 16 and 17-year-olds that we looked at. So if we go to the next slide, this is just a visual representation of what I just told you. So this is Arches versus the comparison group by all the outcomes that we were able to assess, both arrest and reconvictions. And the major findings, again, are any felony reconvictions within 12 months and any felony reconvictions within 24 months. And you'll see for the felony reconvictions within 12 months, the stars represent statistical significance. It's a 1.8% rate for the Arches group and a 5.9% rate for the comparison group. The felony reconvictions within 24 months, you see a 6.2% rate for the Arches group and a 14.3% rate for the comparison group. And these differences are pretty big and rare, actually, for this type of research. To put it in context, if you consider, there have been controlled studies where when you implement interventions that use evidence-based practices, in an ideal situation, you'd expect a difference of 35% in the rate. And obviously, these are much larger than those ideal situations. So this is a pretty rare and unique finding, and it's also pretty consistent when we run it in a bunch of different ways. We ran different models to test if any changes would change these results, and they didn't. So they're pretty robust and very exciting findings. So going to the next slide. This is a little different to reorient here, but I'll show you. These are percent differences by age group. So we looked at first for the 12-month rates. The 0 baseline is basically no difference, and any bars that run below that is arches. The arches rate is lower than the comparison, and anything above that 0 baseline, the arches rate was higher than the comparison group. So just some of the things to look at. The starred bars represent statistical significantly different differences. And so we see some of those differences in the 16 and 17-year-olds, rearrests and reconvictions. You see some of the bigger differences, though, lower for the arches group for the felony reconvictions rate. But you'll notice that they didn't reach statistical significance, and we suspect that's because of the smaller sample sizes in those groups there. So it didn't reach that level, but the test suggests that they're approaching statistical significance. Going to the next slide, looking at the differences in the 24-month rates, you see now that the felony reconviction difference is large, just as in the 12-month, but also statistically significant for the 16 and 17-year-olds, by the way. The next slide. We also looked at the impact of the curriculum, the ARCHES curriculum. So we noticed that there were some statistically significant differences here by some of the outcomes, in particular in felony rearrests and overall reconvictions within 24 months. The boldface percentages represent those statistically significant differences. So we see that among the ARCHES group, those that did not complete the curriculum for ARCHES, which is the completion of the interactive journals, which were discussed, I believe, and also the completion of all of the group sessions. So you see those rates are are higher than the rates for those that do actually complete the entire ARCHES curriculum. So going to the next slide. We were also able to look at changes in attitudes and behaviors from before participants went through the ARCHES program and then after. So we applied this pre and post test. We were able to use a validated tool for this called the Positive Youth Development Scale or Index. And we also tacked on there some assessments of the interactive journals and representation of what was discussed with each journal that was used. And you do see a statistically significant difference both pre and post, higher scores after the ARCHES program was complete. So some of the questions that are asked in this tool is basically changes in relationships with others, how they deal with emotion regulation, and things like that. And so I have this quote here that I think represents these quantitative findings pretty well, and you'll see some other quotes as Matthew comes back on with his implementation findings, but I think this really encapsulates this. This one program participant states, "They help you learn certain things you shouldn't do in certain places, like there's a time for everything. The way you carry yourself, it's different." So that's just really great and a great representation of those findings. So let's go to the next slide, please. And so at the end here, we decided we wanted to look at how the impact of ARCHES geographically. So there are certain ARCHES sites that are in these NEON sites, these neighborhood opportunity networks. And there are some satellite sites off-site, not in a neon. So we compared the rates and the outcomes across this, and we saw that there was no impact between an arches that is in a neon versus an arches that is not in a neon site. So that just represents those findings there. So this summarizes what I've just said. The arches group is less likely to be reconvicted of a felony. The two-thirds reduces by 2/3 within 1 year and over half within 2 years. The curriculum completion is related to recidivism reduction, and the pre and post assessment shows gains in those key attitudinal and behavioral indicators that we were able to measure.
All right. I think I came back. I'm sorry.
Thank you. So now
Can we go
over
back
to
one
Matthew
slide, please?
again.
Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the implementation findings from the Arches evaluation that was conducted by the Urban Institute. Next slide, please. These are broken up into 3 different areas, first of which is best practices, the next of which is the barriers to successful programming, and the third of which will be recommendations from our office. So the first is best practices, and on each slide I'm going to talk about a couple of the best practices and provide a couple of examples of different stakeholders and participants who spoke to those issues. The first of which is close and supportive relationships with mentors and peers. Our urban staff really observed quite a family atmosphere. It was introduced very well at the beginning of this webinar, but the case can be made that that's one of the strongest pieces of the Arches transformative mentoring model. Mentors' status as credible messengers and their availability 24/7 really did provide supports to have individuals improve their attitudinal and behavioral change over the course of the program. And it really also helped build deep connections to both the mentors and the program directly. It helps build trust and communication through a bunch of the different conversations that they would have in the group mentoring and individual conversations. And group mentoring and alumni engagement supports positive peer influence and role models. This can really be stressed through the quote that we provide here from a program stakeholder. Of the mentors I hired initially, one had done 10 years in prison, another might have sold drugs but never went to jail and instead went to a conversion program. One of my mentors was a therapist, another was a woman who grew up in foster care. If a kid came in with an issue, we had our little mod squad to address it. And that really was the case, and this was cross-site. We recognized that these close and supportive relationships and access to the mentors was really the case. The second best practice that I'm going to talk about is the flexible programming structure and how it helps improve engagement and outcomes. Individuals, the mentors themselves were meant to be available to participants 24/7. And there was also a rolling enrollment that's really supported the participant integration and peer influence. And the group mentoring structure really enhanced the relationship development and the organic mentor-mentee relationship and assignment of mentors. And one of the quotes we have here from our evaluation work suggests that we have to have our door open 24 hours a day. I don't mean physically, but each and every one of the participants has my number. This is about you having access to somebody. You have that linkage to somebody. You want to make sure that it's always present. That was from a program stakeholder at one of the program sites that we were on. Next slide, please. Continuing with best practices, the DOP, it was suggested by a bunch of different interviews and focus groups that the Department of Probation and provider relationships were very strong. There was a good working relationship between the Department of Probation's manager of the program and the program sites. They were in constant communication. The proximity also to the neons, the neighborhood opportunity offices where probation officers were on site in many of the Arches locations really did increase access to the services as well as help facilitated client reporting and the probation relationship both to the young individual participant as well as the program site. Often, and this is expressed through a program stakeholder suggesting that oftentimes when a PO wants to file a violation of probation with the courts, they check with the mentor first. good relationships. We invite POs to award nights. We try to involve the POs, tell mentees to use them, not abuse them, and they try to strengthen relationships between youth and probation. It was suggested that there were very strong relationships. However, are also opportunities for enhancing this particular practice, and I'll speak about that in the barrier section coming up. The final practice that I'm going to talk about that we identified as a very strong component of the ARCHES program was the technical assistance. It was very much valued. CCFY provided the direct technical assistance to the site. And they provided a whole host of things, whether it was mentor training, they did facilitation training, and a bunch of other things. But there was definitely a desire for an expanded scope, and that expanded scope was around things like on-site coaching, new training content to include trauma-informed care and crisis intervention. Next slide, please. The barriers to the ARCHES implementation itself, I'm going to sum it up in 2 slides here. I have a couple of suggestions that will follow this that will be made up in the recommendations section as well. But the barriers generally found themselves around a couple of different areas. First of which is the interactive journaling curriculum, which is the core component of the ARCHES program. They employed a interactive journaling curriculum where individuals in the program engaged in a group mentoring approach, and the curriculum was used to talk through different things like behaviors, changes in decision making. But there were really some challenges around how this happened. Across the 8 locations that we visited, it was really inconsistently implemented. And there was also concerns with the structure and the cultural outreach and foundation for the interactive journaling curriculum. It originally was meant to work with adults in detention facilities, and so it was translated to work with young people in the community setting. So there was a little bit of a mix or a miss when it came to some of the components that young people in New York City in particular were looking for. And this can be summed up by the interactive journaling was previously used in detention centers, so the language is for people in facilities. It could be enhanced if it focused on issues young people were dealing with in the community. And that was even more specific to the issues that young people were dealing with in New York City, which are different than most other places. And the second barrier that I'm going to discuss is the maintenance of consistent referrals. There really was an insufficient and inconsistent referral base. This was emphasized by program sites as well as other stakeholders, that just access to a population of young people who were in need of this was limited, and that could be for a number of reasons. While I mentioned the supports and the general positive relationship that the Department of Probation had with the sites, there were definitely still room for improvement. Oftentimes these sites would go out of their way to invite probation officers to awards nights, invite them on outings to try to build up those relationships and then essentially to build up those referrals. But that was still something that was identified as a barrier, that some of the sites were struggling to obtain the appropriate number of participants. And this also kind of came to be whenever the total number of sites was consolidated in 2016. That was a big part of that. So the final barrier that I'm going to talk about on this slide is the inconsistencies that we identified or observed in the group facilitation process and practice. There really was just a variation in skill across the mentors, and that can be expected. But it was also across the sites. There was a wish both for on-site and also the mentors and the program coordinators for an increase in training opportunities to enhance the facilitation of the mentors when conducting these group counseling and interactive journaling components. The first and last barrier that I mentioned on this slide really do kind of go hand in hand. The interactive journaling curriculum and that of the group facilitation practice. Inconsistencies were seen across sites for both, and likely the conversation for recommendation should take both into consideration. Next slide, please. The last two barriers that I'm going to discuss are the length of the program and the part-time status of the mentors. First, there was concerns with the limited dose that was the Arches program. I think this quote says it best. It's ridiculous to think that someone can change behaviors in 6 months after it took 16 or 18 or more years to develop. This is definitely one of the concerns that most of the sites had, that they had wished that the program and the available resources were extended beyond the normal 6 or 9 months and were well beyond 12 months. There's a general broad desire for an increased availability and access to the different sessions from the interactive journals, and participants would also like an opportunity to have access to wraparound services, just additional things that go along with these program sites' access to services and beyond. The last barrier that I'm going to discuss is the part-time mentor status is, as it suggests here, inconsistent with job demands. The reality is that one of the strengths of the program, that being the flexible program structure and its just access and availability to the young people 24/7, also I was partially identified as a barrier in that many of the mentors at the Arches sites were part-time status, and while they were only on site and working with the young people or paid for 10, 15, 20 hours per week, they were expected to be available to the young people 24 hours a day. This was consistently suggested as a barrier for the mentors and the program staff. They were looking for things like full-time access to services, as well as other training opportunities that they could provide professional development for the mentors as well. But it was really important for the mentors to have access to these people 24/7. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk quickly about some of the recommendations that the Urban Institute made in collaboration with our research partners. There are 8 recommendations that we have here. There are actually more that we have in the final report that will be released this month. But I'm going to identify a couple of them here, which I spoke to in either the best practices or the barriers, or in many cases how they overlapped. The second bullet here is tailoring of the curriculum. And there really is an emphasis and a wish that the curriculum could be more consistent with the needs of the young people in New York City. The Urban Institute suggests that not only does the curriculum be tailored, but it also align with participant experiences directly, and that might mean bringing in participants, both current and past participants of the Arches program, to help in the redesign of this curriculum. Also speaking to the issue regarding the length or the dose of the program, we would suggest that it expand the program frequency, the length, and the alumni engagement. I can give an example of one of the observations that we conducted in which a young person who was not in the program anymore, was an alumni, entered the conversation that evening and began telling a story about how their day went and how the Arches program had impacted their life directly. It was one of the most fulfilling parts of the work that we did in identifying just the level of fulfillment that he had from being able to speak to this. So there's really opportunity here for a couple of things. One, because the engagement with the young people who are still in the program was so high, there's an opportunity for the potential for alumni to take part-time, maybe credible messenger classes to come back and be a part of this program in a more specific way. It's definitely worth speaking to expanding eligibility for younger participants. Nancy spoke just recently about the impact that the Arches program had on young people, and a service gap that was identified was that the young people that were age 14 or 15 that might not have access to these services would be of benefit. So maybe expanding the access or eligibility to younger participants would be another one of the recommendations that the Urban Institute would make. But in the end, the outcome, the impact evaluation itself, as well as the implementation work that we did, really suggests that Arches is a very strong program. It works. It should keep going and increase the collaboration for the next phases and the next steps in the programming. Next slide.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. We are now looking to turn it over to the audience. So thank you to those of you who have added any questions to the chat box. We're going to be using that to source questions for the panel. Quickly would like to introduce the members of the panel before we get started. So again, who you heard from at the beginning, we have Paul Richards, Director of the Young Men's Initiative Programming at the Department of Probation, Reverend Maurice Winley, Director of Credible Messenger Mentoring at Community Connections for Youth, myself, Parker Krasny, Matthew Lynch, Research Associate with the Urban Institute, Nancy Andeloro, Research Scientist with DOP. We have Reverend Ruben Austria, who is the Executive Director of Community Connections for Youth, the TA provider for the Arches program. Abdul Malik Talib, a former Arches mentor, community associate with the New York City Department of Probation, and Lloyd J., an Arches alumni and member of the 4A's Arches alumni program with the Community Connections for Youth. So please keep your questions coming. I see so far we have a bit of a mix of questions, both on the evaluation and the program structure. So I think one piece just to start thinking about the actual program model itself, the structure of the intervention, we have a question asking whether mentors engage with participants only through face-to-face contacts or whether there are other modalities such as texting, calling, social media that are used, leveraged to make the mentors available 24/7. So I'm hoping someone on the panel can help to speak to that question.
Contact and stay in contact with our mentees on phone, Facebook. Some of us have Facebook accounts and allow young folks to stay connected to us on Facebook through the social media chains, whether it's Twitter, Instagram. So we stay as available as our young folks need us, and as a present, kind of keep some of our private life out of their sight. But for the most part, we use the social media avenues to stay in contact with our young folks.
And I would just add that the whole concept of 24/7 support, social media, as Abdul stated, is key to facilitating that and just being intentional with our relationship and having that access. We know that young people, that's pretty much the tool that they use, and so all of the mentors make sure that they have that access to the young people, in addition to the one-on-one mentoring, the group sessions, and just the community presence, being that most of the credible messages are from the communities that the young people reside in.
And I can just add from the city's perspective, there are certain mentoring programs that have minimum doses of contact recommended. I'd say we sought always to really give flexibility, agency to probation, to the providers, not to strictly codify any of that. The one-on-one mentoring is an optional component. I think that the real goal of the group mentoring, outside of delivery of the curriculum and the work that's done in the groups, is to give exposure to participants, to multiple mentors, so they have opportunities to organically develop relationships with the mentors where they really connect. And from there, moving into that one-on-one mentorship. And I believe probation, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we see approximately 60 to 70% of participants who engage in group mentoring moving on to then engage in a one-on-one mentoring with an individual mentor at their site. So I wanted to turn us a question. I believe this,
go ahead, Paul. Maybe you can touch to this as well. There are situations that are not actually captured in data, which pertain to, say, overnight crisis intervention as well, which would be considered one-on-one.
Certainly. So this is a question to the evaluation itself. So I wanted to turn perhaps to Nancy or to Matthew. Question is how long participants were followed up for, and what other indicators of success were evaluated or could be evaluated for the program?
So we followed up 2 years after the participants started probation, their probation sentence. So the program runs 6 to 9 months. So we were able to follow them half a year or a little more post their ending the program. Everything that we were able to assess, the successful, some indicator to measure a success in the program, we put in the report. So everything that I've just talked about today is pretty much everything that we were able to get from our data, which are the recidivism outcomes, arrests and reconvictions, and the completion or non-completion of the program. And of course the pre and post measure of the attitudes and behaviors in the program, before and after the program.
And I'd like to add to that just that 2 points. One, regarding the criminal justice recidivism rearrest data, that was data that we collected directly from the state through centralized databases tracking that, not data that require individual follow-up with the participants. So it is objective data, and also did not put the burden on the providers of doing that follow-up. With regard to other outcomes, I can just say we made a conscious decision in our office not to ask probation, not to ask providers to systematically track education, employment, other post-program outcomes, in part because there was a desire to allow the sites to focus in on the work they needed to do with the participants related to the curriculum, the mentoring, and there is always a risk, especially as data flows up in the city, were we to ask for job placements or educational enrollments, that the program could very quickly be reduced to those metrics, those measures as an indicator of success. And there is then, of course, a risk that providers shift their emphasis in terms of activities and their work with participants to focus on trying to achieve those outcomes. So in making a conscious decision not to track those, as much as we knew they were taking place and we knew providers were well aware of those achievements, in not tracking them and reporting them up citywide, I think it ensured that sites would maintain the flexibility to develop their own priorities and how they worked with participants. And I think we're proud to see the results, obviously, with our findings related to recidivism reduction. So another question coming in from the audience is, after reviewing the data, are there going to be any modifications to the interactive journaling curriculum, I believe based on some of the findings that were flagged by Matthew? So I'd like to turn over to probation to hear your thoughts on that.
What we're doing, that's definitely under review. What we did was we called the providers in together to try to come up with a better alternative, because we don't want to change unless we actually have a replacement for those journals. There were a few ideas that came up that we kind of liked that are on the table right now that we're thinking about.
And although
We
you can't
also
hear me,
wanted
this
to
is
bring in some of the mentees as well to find out
yes. I'm
what
sorry,
they
my
like
web camera is
and
not
what's
working right
most
now. But
helpful for them
just to
as
add to
well.
that,
So
and in line with the
definitely on the
recommendation that
table.
Urban would make around this is, we did suggest to establish different working groups with participants, both
And I
current
can add to
and
that too,
past
just that
participants,
these findings
alumni,
have also.
program stakeholders, just to help re-guide and
Matthew?
guide this revamp of the curriculum if one is made.
Okay, the questions are coming fast and furious now, so I'm going to take us through a few. So first, what interactive journals were used? Paul, I believe you can answer best, but I believe they were from the Thinking for Change, or the Change Companies, excuse me. Is that correct?
Thinking for Change series. There are primarily 4 journals that we used. One was Responsible Behavior, Individual Change Plan, Handling Difficult Feelings, and Responsible Behavior.
Gotcha. And there is a question along those lines too, whether the curriculum will be available for other organizations to review or use. I can just, to the point on the journaling curriculum specifically, that is an off-the-shelf series that is available for purchase for other municipalities. In terms of sort of broader support for implementation of the broader program model elsewhere, I would, I guess, turn it back to you, Paul, or to CCFY to speak a bit to what options exist there.
I think the curriculum had lots of positives as far as some really good stuff around cognitive behavioral change, motivational interviewing, stages of change. But the point the evaluators made about the cultural suitability of the curriculum is really well taken. We found that most of the mentors, when first getting trained on the journals, there was stuff about the language in it that was very deficit-based. As the evaluators mentioned, it was something that started in facilities and kind of had a lot of that, you need to focus on fixing your criminal behavior. And as a training provider, we really sought to give the mentors the freedom to try to understand the core lessons of the journals, but really to remix it, if you will, or to deliver it in a way that was culturally competent, and to have a lot of flexibility as far as kind of bringing in their own flavor, their own style, using music videos, using personal life experiences to communicate the lessons. And I think what we're seeing in some of the further iterations of this work in Washington, D.C., they're experimenting with this model and actually doing some really exciting stuff where the mentors and young people themselves are designing curriculum on an ongoing basis as they kind of zone in on these core values and these core principles. So I think there's a lot of good stuff there, but there's also, we see some of the most exciting things, also as the evaluator mentioned, when young people who've been in the program get to try their hand at facilitating a group and take some of those lessons and then again kind of remix them and redo them in a way that really speaks to their reality and to their social context. Lloyd, you want to say anything about the curriculum?
So about curriculum that we use when it comes to running these lessons and preparing the lessons, we start off with an icebreaker to really get the group comfortable, and then we move on. Well, first is a check-in, and then the icebreaker. We check in with them to see how they're doing, how the day was going. If the weekend had passed, what did they do on the weekend, and what things did they get accomplished. From there, we implement the icebreaker where we get, if it's a new group, we get them to feel more comfortable, with each other, and just help each other, really get to know one another more better. From there, we have the lesson, which, the lesson we would take from the interactive journals, and we would implement it within the lessons, which, whether that be, responsible behavior, building relationships, and I think that pretty much about sums it up. And then, like I believe Ruben was saying, we remix it in a way where we're able to, we're able to get the youth to, receive the language, in their type of way. I think that's, yeah.
So one thing, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. One thing that I wanted to actually get out there is that this particular model is not necessarily etched in stone. It's a mentoring program, it's Arch's mentoring program, but this is a movement, right? So it's always evolving. Right now, we, in partnership with the Silverman School of Social Work at Hunter College and Community Connections for Youth, the Department of Probation, we've developed a Credible Messenger Justice Center. It serves as a training and research center, policy and practice thought leader, a program incubator for an approach to social reform at the intersection of government, community, and academia. The Credible Messenger Justice Center seeks to improve, legitimize, and the practice of credible messenger mentoring and other programming in communities and jurisdictions around the country. I would like for Ruben to kind of just really elaborate on how that came about and where we're going with the Justice Center as well.
Okay, so as you've heard, obviously there's some amazing impact results as a result of credible messenger mentoring. I think, as the researchers said, things like 57%, 69% reductions in recidivism, felony reconvictions are things that whether you believe or like this movement or not, are things that you want to pay attention to. But what we've seen with this, as Paul says, a movement, is that this credible messenger movement, this is not something that started here in the Department of Probation. It didn't start in 2012. Credible messengers, whether they were calling themselves that or not, have been doing this for years. And we've seen men and women who are coming home from prison who have just made it their life calling to reach back and help other young people not have to go down that path. And so this project was very inspired by people like Eddie Ellis and others who kind of coined the term credible messenger to talk about returning citizens coming home. But what we're seeing is that all around the country there are these movements of credible messengers. Most of the time they're doing the work without funding, without support. But now I think for the first time in New York City, we have an actual large-scale investment in this work and this workforce, and it's produced some real results. And all over the country, we have people kind of asking about the credible messenger model. And so one of the things we wanted to do with the center was really not, hoard the information or resources, but really spread it and share it. And so it's designed really to do two major things. One is to share the lessons and to invite people from other jurisdictions, whether you're a probation department, a group of credible messengers, legislators, to come and experience the model, to learn about it, to learn tools for replication. The other thing that's important, I think, as the evaluators mentioned, was that this initiative first kind of squeezed out some money for part-time salaries for credible messengers, but credible messengers who, from their heart and their commitment and their passion, were often putting in full-time or double-time work to meet the needs of young people. And so one of the things we've realized in doing this is that there needs to be as much of an investment into credible messengers as we are getting from credible messengers and their services. And so that means things like full-time salaries, and it means things like getting into degrees and advanced degrees, trainings and certifications. There's a whole workforce of people around the city who are credible messengers. I think the latest stats in the US are that there's about 600,000 men and women coming home from prison every year. And if we just imagine what an amazing thing it could be for those men and women to become a labor force of people who are investing in young people and helping and supporting them. And that goes beyond just mentoring programs. We envision credible messengers going into schools. We envision credible messengers in the parks. We envision credible messengers in government. And part of what we want to do with the center is just to make as many training opportunities as possible available, make those linked in with the city of New York and where certifications can come into being. And again, just really spread the model. And I just have to say, from the model, I think the evaluators have said this, we're very clear about it. This is not a prefab, off-the-shelf model, a blueprint that you can just take and replicate. What the model really is investing in the community members from the communities that are most impacted. And that can grow and develop in many different ways. So if I had to make a very important statement, it would be that, all of the tools are helpful, the curriculum is helpful, the groups are helpful, all of the different components are helpful, but the heart of it is really the mentoring relationships that come from community helping community. And that's really what the model is. And we want to use the Credible Messenger Justice Center to also even help jurisdictions and government agencies and other departments who are charged with this, who might be fearful or have some trepidation about partnering with community, to really see you can do this. You can develop real authentic partnerships with community and things will be good.
Thank you, Ruben. Just a quick point of clarification from the chat board. Lily Shapiro, Senior Policy Advisor with the Department of Probation, clarified the curriculum in use in the program is from the Change Companies. It's the Forward Thinking series, not Thinking for Change, which is another journaling curriculum. So just wanted to confirm that. With regard to the point around the movement of credible messengering, I also do want to flag that this is a strategy that is currently employed in several other initiatives within New York City and nationally, but here in the city, in addition to the Arches program, the Young Men's Initiative, my office, the Mayor's Office for Economic Opportunity and Probation partnered together on a juvenile alternative to placement program, AIM, which is a one-on-one credible messengering model. We also see this employed certainly in the Cure Violence program, which has scaled up considerably across New York City. And beyond that, I would say it's a strategy that has existed for years organically within several justice service provider organizations across the city, some of which have explicit targets around hiring employees who have backgrounds. But one piece not captured in this evaluation, but in some prior qualitative evaluation work of the Arches program that I think is another exciting finding worth noting. We heard anecdotally from a few nonprofits who were contracted to run the Arches model that it was the first time as an organization that they had hired individuals with criminal records to work on their staff, and that the program had helped to support a rethinking of hiring practices agency-wide, where those nonprofits were now looking to this population for direct service and other staff roles in programs outside of Arches, outside of AIM, that specifically call for this this kind of a role. So I think it speaks just to the promise of these credible messenger staff, and I think is a really exciting development that we're seeing just take roots organically across nonprofits. I also want to flag, we've had a couple of questions come in around becoming a mentor in the program. We had an earlier question around whether mentors are still on probation or in the system, or if there is a requirement of a certain amount of time since justice system involvement that mentors that needs to elapse before someone is eligible to become a mentor. And subsequent to that, just a question asking more generally about how credible messengers are I'm pulling it up. How credible messengers are recruited, screened, and whether they go through any background checks. So we'd love to turn it back over to the panel to speak to any of these processes around mentor identification, recruitment, and hiring.
Well, typically, the way we would facilitate engaging credible messages recruiting, we look to the community. We look for those individuals who already have a reputation of doing this type of work. We facilitate hiring panels. Obviously, all credible messages will complete an application. There is a background check. There's a deep conversation about their history. And so I would say, even to your point, we've had individuals who were even on parole. Their parole officer was aware of their involvement with the project. We maintain contact as needed. So that didn't bar anyone. Again, the interview, the hiring panel, the background check, as long as there's full disclosure. Obviously, if there was anyone who had sexual offenses, things of that nature, we wouldn't consider them for this particular opportunity. But at the same time, really looking for that community validation. That's really one of the key indicators for us. And also a sense of mission. We didn't want individuals that just coming with an opportunistic outlook, just wanting to get a job, but really who wanted to really make an indelible impact in their community. And so looking at the hiring panels, which would involve different community leaders, to just help assess and discern if this individual has those type of ingredients. Again, there was full disclosure in regards to criminal history. Yes, we did complete background checks, but that, again, did not exempt individuals. I myself have a number of staff who are on active parole and are managing programs as we speak.
And I just think too, historically you get things like saying, well, there should be a 5-year gap between your release from prison or your last reconviction. But I know within the context of this Arches program, there's men and women who have come home from prison and within a month been hired as a mentor in this initiative. But it's not just out of the blue, it's because maybe somebody who's been home for 3 or 4 years, that person was their mentor behind bars. And they could say, going back to wherever it was, if it was Sing Sing or Attica or, this person mentored me, this person helped me turn my life around. And so groups like Exodus Transitional Community that have those relationships kind of in and out of prison are really key, right? That you're not just looking for somebody who does or does not have a certain record on their background, but rather you're looking for a history of being a life transforming person. On the other hand, we have people come in who are very young and new to the work, and that could present its own challenge, but a really good ingredient for that was if you had a lead mentor who was kind of an older, respected, very strong leader who could take some of the younger credible messengers under their wing and really kind of mentor them as they mentored others.
We've also had a question from the audience about how one would go about finding out about becoming a credible messenger. So I don't know whether there is a centralized hiring process within the city at this point, but I can flag on the Department of Probation's website, you can identify a full list of current Arches program providers. And that might be one place to start. But if anyone else on the panel has any other thoughts, if anyone here listening is interested in joining up as staff on a program.
You can find credible messages in the local, in the churches, the mosques, places where civic and religious leaders sit and really congregate, because that's where some of us came from. Like just going into our own houses of worship, speaking to our leadership, and then these opportunities being made available through the relationships that the clergy has. Also, I'm just gonna say, if you're good in your community and people know you, those that are involved will always be looking to help just give that message and help somebody else change their life. They'll always share, like, listen, this is what I'm doing right now, and if you want to be a part of this, then come on. And then it's like, word of mouth, that whole referral piece. Like, so if you know someone who's already involved in it and you're interested, just speak to them, and definitely you can look at go into your houses of worship and see if there's information in the houses of worship, and if somebody there can point you in the right direction.
I believe also that if you're interested in pursuing a career as a credible messenger or volunteering or a job, that you can go to the website, the cmjcenter.org. That's CMJ as in Credible Messenger Justice Center.org. And just sign up for more information. One of the things that we anticipate happening, I mean, there's probably a couple hundred credible messengers hired right now through initiatives like Arches, Next Steps, also through the Cure Violence programs. But our vision for this Credible Messenger Justice Center is that that just more and more people who fit that category can step up into leadership roles, whether that's a full-time position, or it may be something like just doing some groups with young people in a middle school a couple hours a week. We just see that around this city, probably around this country, there is such a need and a hunger among young people to have somebody to look up to, who looks like them, who's from their community, who's been through what they've been through. And we've got way too many barriers out there about who can and cannot work with youth and who can and cannot work in certain situations. We really believe that credible messengers are the answer to so many of the challenges that we face. And so if you are interested in getting on that path, we'd love to connect with you. So please go to the website and sign up, and we'll figure a way to meet you at some point in time.
Thank you. And I want to make sure before we run out of time, we had a nice meaty question earlier in the chat, which is, how do we make sure that this program is institutionalized? How do we make sure this program keeps going? And I can just say, I think we've spoken to this a bit with discussing the forthcoming work of the Credible Messenger Justice Center. I think we are all hopeful too that this evaluation report, having demonstrated not just impact, causal impact with the program, but really of a magnitude that is unique on participant recidivism, that this will certainly support the city and other jurisdictions to keep this kind of work moving forward. Additionally, I would flag that this is a program that was originally privately funded through the Young Men's Initiative with a grant from Bloomberg Philanthropies. And the program operated for several years with that funding. And prior to this evaluation being complete, the city did, upon the end of that grant, did make a commitment to sustaining this program moving forward, and has committed new public dollars to the Department of Probation, which has allowed the program to stay alive. So I think as it stands now, this program is well positioned to thrive, but I certainly would love to hear more from the panel too on what more you think we all need to do to ensure that this program stays institutionalized and stays alive.
Well, for me, it's, again, as you heard me state before, it's all about community, and it's all about relationships. As I stated before, the goal here, although it was about mentoring, it was about a program, it was about mentoring, but it was really so much more than that. It was really more of a movement. It was about us partnering up with the community, building capacity for that community to really, really nurture and serve their own. This was so important to the Department of Probation. As a probation officer, I can tell you 75% of us are from those same communities. We may have gone in a different direction, but we're from those communities that are hurting. And it was very important to us when we first developed this program, came up with the concept that we bring in those providers that were there in the community and went out, spoke to the community about what we were trying to do in order to get them on board to carry this forward.
I think also just really those that are impacted, and it's on all levels of people that have been impacted, whether it's the actual mentees, the mentors, the system stakeholders, really going and taking their messages to whoever is willing to listen to it, and sharing the stories of what has happened and how it's transformed even the lives of the officers who get involved with the young folks that have been clients and now are working as credible messengers. Like Lloyd here, being a credible messenger, a mentee, moving through the system, over several years, from program to being a participant, to becoming a mentor himself, to now sitting here to really be a messenger of what has transformed his life. Myself coming from the institution to doing the work in the community, to be a part of the structures that kind of have formed what transformative mentoring looks like over the last 5 years. To really just go out and continue to give this message to the people and say, listen, this is something that works. It doesn't work for everybody, but it's definitely an opportunity to do something different, dynamic, and just change the conversation, the focus on what happens to our young folks, entering into the criminal justice system.
And expanding on that, I just want to say, from a research and evaluation perspective, to carry that message, showing that this works, is really basically evaluations like this, and replication and retesting of it to show that these are real outcomes and it works.
And I would say too that the don't want you to miss what Parker said about this may have been started with a nice big grant from private philanthropy, but New York City, once they saw, even before the evaluation results were in, but when they saw the impact that it was having, figured out a way to work it into the actual probation budget through tax levy money, through committing public dollars that are pretty much expected to be there on an ongoing basis. Michael Forte, who is doesn't like the publicity. He's the man behind the camera. He was instrumental in figuring that out. But I think we're really at a moment in this country where we've realized that incarceration doesn't work. There's a lot of talk about how to move resources from the criminal justice system to support people in communities. Some good work has been done about moving those things into services and into kind of more of the mental health and substance abuse. There has not been enough reinvested directly into impacted communities and into the individuals who are most impacted. And I think what Credible Messengers does is it allows those resources to be reinvested in the very people who can actually make a difference in the community. So if we think about the money that is out there, that could come from closing prisons, that could come from reducing the amount of people who are flowing through this justice system, there really are a lot of resources out there to invest in this work, and that's investing in people instead of punishment.
And I would just add to look at the existing systems within the community, whether it's schools, et cetera, to find and carve out niches for credible messengers to be gainfully employed and bring what they bring uniquely to those spaces. And again, as Ruben's already said it, just to invest in the power of transformation. Push the envelope on the stigmas that are often placed on individuals who have once upon a time violated laws, and really look at the value of that experience and how they can really share that in a strategic, significant, and sustainable way.
And on the research front, I would flag too, as mentioned, we do anticipate the final report of this evaluation is going to be released publicly later on this month, and we will ensure that all attendees of this webinar will be sent a copy. Additionally, we are going to be presenting these findings at a national conference, a couple of national conferences upcoming, and looking to further disseminate them through other research clearinghouses and media outlets. So we are very hopeful that we can really use this research as an impetus to ensure that this movement continues on and thrives moving forward. So lastly, from Charles Dodson, I just see a comment which feels pertinent to this point. A movement isn't a movement if it doesn't move. The great people on the panel have helped to build a Credible Messenger initiative in Washington, D.C., and we are changing lives and reimagining the justice system. Keep up the great work. So in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere in the country too, we've seen interest in this model, and we are very confident that we're going to be able to carry it forward. So I want to end there. Thank everyone who's joined us on today's panel from Probation, CCFY, our colleagues at the Urban Institute, and with the Young Men's Initiative. Thank you all for joining, and keep an eye out in your inboxes for the final report to be released